Welcome back to the darker side of the after show. I'm your host, Sean, joined as always by my co host, Lukey from ITR Boxing. And this episode is a reflection of the life and the times and the moments and the funny moments of Mr. Neon Leon Spinks. It was one hell of a story, one hell of an episode. And myself and Johnston thoroughly enjoyed learning more about Mr. Spinks and his life and some of the ups and the downs and the comical moments. And it's now time to reflect upon that episode with yourself, Lukey. And as always, when we bring you into this episode and we talk about initial reactions, I'm keen to know what your interpretations of Leon Spinks were going into this, and now if there's been any changes or if it's just reaffirmed what you already knew about Leon Spinks.
My relationship with Spinks was the Ollie fight, and having watched Ollie documentaries all my life, that's one of the tent poles of the Ollie documentary that kind of signals the end in most Ollie narrative structures. I think beyond that, beloved fighter in his area. You look at guys like Corey Spinks, basically got a lot of their buzz basically being related to Leon and Michael Spinks and the Spinks brothers. So my initial thought was just kind of those general concepts. What I didn't know was how humorous he was. And that was kind of like the takeaway from this.
He was a humorous individual, like well loved by many people, and like although this is the darker side of boxing, and a lot of the narratives that we cover for the show are sort of dark and grim and difficult issues outside of the ring, and Leon was no exception really. He had difficult issues outside of the ring, and I think what it was for me was the whole bright lights of boxing, as we titled the episode. You know, Neon Leon Spinks and the bright lights of boxing, and what the metaphor really is there is that them bright lights of boxing can either go one way or another, and in boxing you get to see some guys go to the top and rise to prominence and have all that fame and fortune as a result of it, and live a good life. And then you get the other side of the fence where you get guys like Leon Spinks, who they basically do something in the sport that is so significant that they'll be remembered forever for it by, but then they don't end up going on to sort of have that star-studded career that you essentially expect them to have. And I think what I took away from this was that I knew from previous episodes that I'd done with Johnston that him and obviously Michael go to the Olympics and they win medals and they're hometown heroes, and it basically looks like these two guys are going to go on and, you know, dominate their divisions respectively. And ultimately what I took away from it was that it was contrasting both of their lives and their stories, because whilst Michael had the better career overall, Leon was the one that was classed as the more talented fighter in many people's eyes, and he had that big significant moment where he beats Muhammad Ali in like his eighth professional fight, and it's huge, and it is a moment that'll be remembered forever in this sport. And it's at that moment where everything just seems to change for him, and life just kind of goes really fast and really hard. And as a side note, what I didn't know about Leon going into this episode was that Mr. T was actually his bodyguard for a quaint number of years, and I found that quite interesting, hilarious, and it was good to hear some of the stories from his perspective, being Leon's bodyguard, about what really goes on behind the scenes and how there's so many hangers on when you're a winner, and how there's absolutely nobody there when you're a loser.
Very true words. And I think the other thing that I couldn't help but think, he was Buster Douglas before Buster Douglas. We just don't think of him in that way because Buster Douglas was such a massive upset compared to this. But at the time, he was one of the guys that had pulled off one of the biggest upsets, Ali prior against Liston. But this in its era was one of the biggest upsets.
It had to be the biggest upset of the 1970s. 100%. It was. It'll be remembered as one of the biggest upsets in boxing history. Of course, it will. And it is Buster Douglas before Buster Douglas. But I think the difference between the two fights that we're talking about there, obviously Tyson Douglas and Spinks and Ali, is the fact that Leon Spinks had this incredible amateur career, and he had this medal that came from the Olympics as a result of his incredible amateur career. So the expectation for someone like Spinks was very high. And much like a Lomachenko of this generation, he goes into his pro career, and very early on, he gets put into this position to fight for the title against Ali, who essentially overlooks him in that first fight. And while his skills are evidently declining, you know, you can see that Leon Spinks had everything he needed that night to beat an aging Ali. And then obviously they have the rematch, and Ali wins the rematch. And then from that moment on, really, Leon Spinks' career just starts to plummet a little bit, and he starts to get involved in issues outside of the ring. Drug abuse, yet again, is a big problem with a lot of these boxers, and we've seen it even in today's generation. I mean, we've seen Ricky Hatton, we've seen Joe Calzaghe, and now we've just seen Kell Brook go viral on social media with a video of him snorting what appears to be cocaine, which just seems to have been confirmed it's cocaine, off a table. And it's just shocking that someone like a Leon Spinks is remembered in sort of different ways by different people. Like, I now remember him as the guy that beat Muhammad Ali, the guy that had the potential to have a star-studded career, and yet he rose to prominence and fall from grace so quickly. And that's kind of what I've taken away from this whole story with Leon.
Very much so. I think that to me, another big thing that I take away with Leon Spinks is sometimes when you beat a great fighter like a Bernard Hopkins or some of these, it really does the opposite, you know? Like Buster Douglas beats Mike Tyson, but he doesn't really go on to have that career. Spinks has the accolades. He beats Ali, he doesn't have that career. Sergey Kovalev basically loses the minute he beats Bernard Hopkins. Chad Dawson loses the minute he beats Bernard Hopkins. We often think about the passing of the torch or the underdog that comes up, but I think just as often when the guy gets the big win, their life goes to shambles.
Yeah, and I think it takes a certain type of fighter, doesn't it? And a certain type of human being to be able to continue that consistency of living such a clean life outside of the sport. And for somebody like Leon, who came from the Pruitt Igo projects, you know, a really difficult upbringing, a really difficult neighborhood, naturally, he's always going to have that street kid within him because that's how he's grown up. And it's like Michael seemed to kind of move on from that part of his life and continued to sort of move in a different direction. Whereas Leon, it was always there. It never left him. It was just all that had happened is that the fame and the fortune that came with it and the hangers on that came with it just brought that back out of him, brought that street kid back out of him. And someone who was so poor to have everything thrusted upon them sort of relatively early on, and too many people being involved and too many hangers on being involved. It's difficult, and you see it in the modern era. You see fighters where you see the rise to prominence and you think this is an amazing fighter who's going to do so much. They win a huge fight, they get so many hangers on come around them, and all of a sudden the way they go into these fights, their attitude, their motivation levels just change completely. And someone that we've covered for career profiles is Prince Nazim Hamed. He's a prime example here in the UK of a fighter who got it all to the top, seemingly was going to be the guy that would rule the division, and then he just let it all go because of his antics outside of the ring. Not because he was a drug addict, just because he was arrogant and he didn't have that mental strength and capability to be able to maintain what he was doing, and he become lazy. And it was a fighter by the name of Marco Antonio Barrera who exposed all of that in their fight in 2001. And for Leon Spinks, it is very sort of a similar situation, but very much earlier on during the late 1970s and into the 80s. He gets drawn into that party and that sort of street life that's always been within him. And it just affects his career so much. And it made me laugh at the fact that going into the Ali fight, you know, he was doing it then. Like the stories of him sort of taking drugs all the way up to the Ali fight, the fact that he's sleeping with people all the way up to the Ali fight, and there's even a story in there in the episode about the fact that Ali comes out to do his road work and he sees Leon coming in, thinking that maybe he's already beat him to his road work, and actually he's coming in from a party, and it's like, how did Leon Spinks beat Muhammad Ali that particular day, given the fact that he was partying all the time? That just kind of goes to prove that he was obviously a very talented individual and he met Muhammad Ali at the right time.
I think sometimes chaos breeds success, right? It's not a very long lasting one, but in all forms of sport, we always see these figures who have these runs, whether it's Dennis Rodman in basketball, Spinks in this moment. There's many different examples of these kind of people that live this crazy party life. But then what do we always know about that? There's no form of sustainability. Once whatever they've done gets elevated or they have to replicate it, there's too much variant when you're doing too many things outside of the task at hand. And I just think that maybe this can work on one occasion, but we've never really seen the consistent time and time again performance that works over 10 years using this formula.
I don't think there's many fighters that can make this type of a life work. I mean, look at the fighters we've covered for the darker side of boxing that were synonymous with this type of party life. Hector Camacho, the opening episode. Johnny Tapia, the opening episode of season 2. I mean, there's two fighters straight away that you make sort of the comparisons to in terms of their life outside of the ring. And it's becoming more of a frequent occurrence as more episodes get delivered to everybody, is that you kind of see this pattern and trend forming of fighters who succumb to this sort of party life, this life of taking narcotics, this life of sort of thinking that they're that good of a fighter that they can kind of get away with not training as much as what they need to train. But it's that hunger level and that success and the desire to win that drops as the fame and fortune come in. And it takes a certain kind of human being, I think, with that mental strength to be able to be consistent with something like that. I mean, there are fighters out there, of course there are. There were many fighters over the years that have been able to achieve such greatness and been able to withstand from all of the pleasures and the absolute drug taking moments of being outside of the ring. I think what I saw from this and what I took away from this story was another rise to prominence and a harsh fall from grace. And as you go through the course of the episode and the story, you start to realize by the fact that he's losing certain fights that you probably would have expected him to win, and then the fact that you can sort of see it's having an effect on his health as well, and you can see by interviews that were done in the mid 1980s that he's starting to slur a bit, he's starting to sound a bit punch drunk, and is getting hit far too often. And as time went on in his life, it was even more evident. And the more interviews that were done throughout the 90s, into the 2000s, all the way up until in passing. I mean, it's really sad to see some of the interviews up until he passed, where you can't understand him. You can't understand what he's saying throughout the course of these interviews. And it's a really sad state of affairs, what it kind of came down to. And I just feel that pit of sadness within me, thinking, this was a guy that had the world at his feet. And again, he was, like they said, Leon being Leon. He was a nice guy, but even Michael, his own brother, couldn't control what he was doing. And he was just easily led, easily influenced. And ultimately, it was his downfall overall. His health declined. His mental health declined. He gets cancer. He unfortunately passes away at the age of 67. And you just sort of sit back and you think about everything, and you just feel a little bit sad for him, sad for his wife at the time, Brenda, and it just leaves this sort of little bit of a hole for me with him. And like, I feel sad. I know he's achieved quite a lot more than what people will ever achieve in the sport, but I also always have that thought of, he could have been so much greater, or he could have, again, shoulda, woulda, coulda. He could have done so much more in the sport. But I suppose what I take away from it, Lukey, is what he did in the sport was so significant that it's left this lasting legacy on him as an individual. And I think the first thing people think of when you talk about Leon Spinks, if they don't talk about the fact that he had two missing front teeth, they talk about the fact that he beat Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, and I think that also he stayed close to the Marine Corps is something that's kind of downplayed in his story. To me, with Spinks, we always talk about live life without regrets, but it feels like if you're going to be anyone that lives a life of some type of life, you're going to deal with depression in a certain way and you're going to have regrets. Like it's inevitable. That's probably why we don't say it. And it feels like Leon Spinks had one of the more turbulent versions of that story on a public platform.
One of the things that surprised me with Leon's story was that he wasn't a very good father for many years to his children. And as time went on and maybe realization kicked in and life got the better of him, he realized, he had so many great people in his life around him that just wanted his time. And it was nice as we went through the end of the story that he managed to repair relationships with his children, meeting his grandchildren, and in some ways, like a little bit of kind of redemption for past failings were kind of there at the end. And it just felt a bit of a sad end because, he died at 67. 67 really in this generation is kind of young. And you would expect Michael Spinks to still be with us now and still telling stories and still having that time with his family. And it just felt really saddening to me as a human, sort of knowing that as he got to the end, that redemption came from him, where he picked everything back up in his life and made it good again. And then something like the big C word comes along and just cripples him completely and just takes his life away. And it is sad. I find it really sad, but I also feel quite sort of heartwarmed to know that he was able to sort of make reconciliations with the right people in his life, before the end, and he was able to show them the love that needed to be shown and build them relationships or repair them relationships that needed to be repaired. And that was kind of a nice part of the story for me. And I hope that kind of came across to everybody when we was telling it that, we've presented some funny moments of him having one of the largest penises in the world, according to an ex-girlfriend, and some of these funny moments of him partying. But the realities are harsh, harsh realities. And I think we really enjoyed being able to sort of tell the story of the relationships at the end. And that's one of the big things that I kind of took away from his story about not knowing about the issues he was as a father, him not being a great father, but then him sort of making up for things at the end.
I hope he found his peace, right? Because all of us at some point, I think we aim to find peace, and that's a big thing. Listening to a lot of this reminded me of my friend Jerry Hoffman, who was instrumental in women's boxing, and sadly he passed away a few years, and he left far too soon too, which was unfortunate. And he would always talk about a fighter and go, I bet if they could do it again, they'd come to the shows and they'd be there. And listening to this, I heard Jerry's words in my head saying, I bet if Leon could do it again, he'd do it again, because it feels like, I don't want to say we glorify or glamorize the pain and the struggle, but when it was probably really bad, it was really bad. And it's ridiculous to us because we lead functional lives, but it was probably pretty damaging and hard for the people around him because it never stopped. And I hope that he found his peace in those, from his actions that probably alienate him quite a bit from his peers.
So when you say do it again, do you mean in the sense that he would relive that whole scenario again, or would he do it differently?
Well, I'm sure he wouldn't do it the same way because, I mean, his life is, a lot of it as an adult is self-induced pain.
Yeah, I mean, some people say that they would certainly want to change things in life and go through the boxing careers and do things quite differently. And I'm sure many people do have the same regret when they retire and when they move on from the sport and when they get to that sort of age where, death is a creeping up on you, unfortunately. And I think you kind of see some fighters that'll say, I wish I would have done this or I wish I would have had this. But then you also see some that said, I'll just do the same thing again. I would have just gone through the same cycle again. I wouldn't change it for the world. It's usually the saying that a lot of them use because it wouldn't have gotten to where they were if they wouldn't have gone through that ride. And I suppose it's how you have a perspective on life. Do you have that perspective of life where, it's a journey, it's one journey that you're on, and you can't change what happens on that journey, but you can certainly look back on it and try and remember the more positive moments of that particular journey. Or you can be someone that kind of lives with that wholehearted regret of, I wish I would have done this with my career, or I wish I would have not taken them drugs, and I wish I would have trained better for this fight. And I think you do get two contrasting characters, really. Like, you either get one that'll say, I'm happy I did what I did and I had the career that I had, and you'll get the other that kind of wishes they would have done so many different things to have changed things. So I suppose, what do you kind of believe? What do you think about, as a human being, as an individual, when it comes down to that? Do you side with that one person who doesn't live with the regret of how things have gone throughout the career, or do you go for the other side of it and just kind of live with that regret and kind of constantly beat yourself up. And I know there's so many different people in the walk of life that have two different contrasting sort of standpoints and interpretations of that. So it is an interesting sort of conversation to have. And obviously, you mentioned your good late departed friend who sort of talked about that methodology behind it, and it was really interesting. I think Leon was a type of character where would he have done things the same way again? You would like to think he wouldn't have done, but then I think maybe because of who he was as a person and his lack of education growing up, and he's he was obviously had some learning difficulties growing up. I think Leon probably would have just lived this life again. I just get that feeling he would have been the type of person that just would have took the ride once more, regardless of the fact that it ended up where it ended up. He would have done it. And I think that's one of the other things I kind of took away was like him as an individual. Although I never got the chance to meet him or speak to him, I just kind of get this feeling that if I would have got that chance, he would have been the exact same character and individual that everybody else said he was, and it would have been, not sort of a different conversation that we would have been having. Like we would have been hearing the same things that we were portraying and the quotes that we were using for the episode about Leon. But I overall enjoyed telling that story about him. Like it doesn't necessarily sort of fit into the darker side of boxing in a way where you think of some of the other episodes that we've covered, but for us, it was about presenting the story of a man who had a career that could have been something much greater, which was great. Of course, it was great, but it could have been something much greater. But again, it's the dark side of life and being within the sport and the fame and fortune of boxing that dragged him right down into that dark side of the sport. And that's kind of the premise behind what we did this episode for with Leon. We wanted to tell all the different stories and all the different moments in his life and his boxing career that kind of led to where things were. Him sweeping floors in the auditorium where he once stood with his medal being presented to the crowd and being presented to the hometown. I thought that was a really strange come full circle moment.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely a very American story. It has everything involved in it, where it has sorrow, it has triumph, it has humor. It's not simple, right? And I don't know. I think I carry too much baggage right now when I listen to these stories because I think I'm battling depression myself. So everything I look at is depressed and I'm angry. And then when I listen to this story, I just bring myself into it. And probably Leon was more of a lovable character who's jolly and just making bad decisions at times and just enjoying feeling good. And I think I just put my own baggage with all the stuff I'm dealing with. So I think it's hard for me to really be the most objective when looking at this story, too.
I can understand that. It's a difficult thing to be going through, and I think everybody goes through these really challenging moments of their lives. And I think like we bring you onto the show, and you're going at this from a completely different perspective than me, who's trying to sort of stay balanced and as objective as possible. But I suppose when you're in a certain mind frame, it must be even more difficult to kind of sort of comprehend certain things and maybe like some things are more relatable because of
Well, I
the fact
think
that
with him, I look at him as guys that I grew up in the gym with, right? So it's like Leon Spinks to me, his story, the way I normalize it is he was the guy that helped me in the gym. He was a good friend, but he was completely unreliable to show up to sparring. He was completely unreliable to necessarily be there every day. He was someone that would mold you into the person you are, mean well, but his demons would make him completely unreliable. And he'd serve, sadly, at least some of these people did for me in my young adulthood, as cautionary tales of, I want to do a little bit better than them. Not that I judge them, but I don't want to end up on this track because I grew up in the gym with the guy that slurs his speech and talks slow and spars every kid in the gym. It's to me, it serves as more of a cautionary tale of respect his legacy, but also respect that this is what the sport of boxing can do to you.
and with that I think that's a good way to kind of bring a close to this darker side of the after show where I can't have put it any better myself, and I hope that everybody listening to this episode you've enjoyed Leon's tale and it's taught you a thing or two and you've been able to get a little bit more educated and know some more information about Leon if you didn't already know some of this stuff. And that's what we love to do. We love to bring you these stories that give you all different perspectives from different people that were there, and our own opinions personally. And then obviously, Lukey, you come on the after show and you give your completely different perspective of sort of where you see Leon and how you can compare it to your own life and how it can sort of be relatable in parts to your own life. And it is really good to have that conversation on this show, because we're able to sort of project our own feelings, and relate to our own personal lives as to some of these moments that Leon Spinks went through as an individual and as a human being. And this is what we all boil it down to at the end of the day. We're only human. People make mistakes. Humans make mistakes. It's about how you learn from their mistakes is what matters. And I think with Leon Spinks, he wasn't able to learn from those mistakes, and that's why he had such a long time throughout his life and his boxing career where it was just up and down, and it was a huge roller coaster ride. At the one point, he was at the highest peak of the roller coaster, beating Muhammad Ali, and then he would just go down this huge dip, and that dip would take him right to the very bottom, which would be ending up in the auditorium sweeping the floors for minimum wage and probably less than minimum wage. And but yeah, he was just content within himself, and I just found that sort of so strange, but yet a feeling of sort of that's that heartwarming feeling of that
Can
he was happy. He was happy with that.
I want to add one thing because this story reminds me of James Page, who's from where I'm from, and he's probably going to be on the darker side of boxing one day. And maybe we'll even get him on this show. Is he was a world champion and then he was a bank robber. He robbed banks 2 times in his life, went to prison. And now I believe he's installing solar, but at the time, I believe he was working at the grocery store. So I think that for a lot of people, this story is very foreign. But for me, that's someone that I ran into working a very ordinary job that when I was a kid, he was a world champion. So I think part of my difficultness with this is a very real story for me. People that I know who are doing well, they are going to be working minimum wage jobs, modern champions. It's not an if, there will be a lot of them. And I guess I just wanted to share that. Like this isn't an anomaly. This is very common.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. It is. You always wonder what happens to certain fighters within this sport once they leave the sport. Some of them become so successful that they're set for life. Some of them, are basically living in state houses that are provided for by the governments, and they're given money to basically live because they can't afford to be able to support themselves, or they're going and working low-end paid jobs to be able to support themselves whilst dealing with the medical issues that have come as a result of boxing careers. And it happens a lot, and I think it's a scary, scary thought to know that there's absolutely hundreds and thousands of fighters across the world that are exactly in the same position. The reason Leon Spinks is so different, and why he's getting this tail is because of the fact that he went on to such greatness in his career that his legacy has been cemented in boxing history. And yet we cover this show and we cover the downfalls of a lot of these fighters that we cover, and I think it's kind of evident again that we've got another fighter here who had such a huge downfall throughout his life and his career that it was just such a shame that it had to be the way it was. And I can understand why it's relatable for you, because you do know, and I know of many fighters that have since passed their careers and kind of are living what you wouldn't expect them to be living in. And it is sad, it is hard, and it is sometimes you have to kind of take yourself away from that realism to be able to present stories like this. And I hope that everybody listening, you can kind of relate to this in some way, because I'm sure if you don't know anybody that's within boxing, maybe you do know somebody that's within sport in general and has been maybe moderately to majorly successful within a sport, and then they've just had this big fall from grace, but they've cemented the legacy, but yet they could be just living in on a council estate. If it's in the UK, it's like a council estate. It's basically where all the poorest of the poor live. And you get that in the suburbs of America as well. You get the poor, deprived areas where it is just difficult, and you get so many people, so many fighters that have entertained us over the years that are just living in these really, really difficult areas. And it's hard and it's sad, and it is a hard and sad sort of part of the tale that we've done for this. But what I hope people have taken away from it is learning more about Leon and more about him as an individual and as a person, and take away any negatives just for just a moment and sort of focus on the positives of him as a human being. And there were many of them. There were certainly many of them, regardless of his flaws, and that's what we took out of it, and that's what was so great about this episode for us, was learning more about him as an individual. And the guy that always smiled through everything that he went through. He did what he did, and yet he just still smiled and kind of got through everything he got through. So I hope you guys listening to this have been able to take that side of it away from the episode as well. And Lukey, I've got to say, big thanks to you, because you're going through some tough times personally, and yet you come on the
That's
show.
fine. People are dealing with much worse than me, and they listen to the show. So it'd be a real scumbag move if there's people out there that listen and are excited about this show. So you don't know, someone could have a real illness, someone could be battling depression, someone could be suicidal. Listening to forms of entertainment are some of the healthiest things that can lead to people making good decisions, get knowledge. So it's no issue. Yeah, things aren't the greatest, but they could be a lot worse. And I'm never someone that goes, "Oh, sit here, I'm so sad." No, I deal with it and I try my best, and sometimes I'm a prick. But I it's important. It's important because it matters to your listenership.
Absolutely, and it's always appreciated. There's many of our listeners that do message and say they really love having you on, and for those that do love having Lukey on the show, please, 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 just tweet him at Lukey Boxing on Twitter. Please just tweet him on there and just tell him, because I tell him a lot. I tell you all the time how much I enjoy having you on and how much I appreciate you coming on the show. But I think sometimes it's always nice to hear it from just the random people that listen to the show. They come from all parts of the world, and when you get those messages, it's nice. It's uplifting. So for those that listen and enjoy listening to Luke on the Darker Side of the After Show, and also listen to his own stuff at ICR Boxing, please just let him know how much you appreciate what he does, because I appreciate it, and I know a lot of other people do. And it's always a pleasure having you on, and it's always a pleasure talking about these things and these different elements of the sport that we love to talk about. And it's a great episode, and I hope everybody's enjoyed it. And if you have, please do let us know on social at Darker Side of Boxing. You can find us on Twitter at darker_side_pod. And you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on TikTok. Just type in BTR Boxing Podcast Network and you'll find all the other shows available through that conduit. But that's it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed this episode talking all about the legacy of Leon Spinks.